Thank you, Bridget. Backed by royal command, not by popular demand, but pleased to be back at the podium. We had a lengthy discussion this morning on Brexit, so I'm not going to repeat the material we had. But what we know is that the plebiscite last year, the referendum in the United Kingdom, voted to leave something, but really didn't vote to deal with what should be the consequences. Nor extraordinarily did David Cameron, the former Prime Minister, prepare the way for any alternative other than the presumption that he would lead a winning campaign. What we do know is that this is the first act of post-Second World War disintegration in Europe. What we do know is that we're going to lose a country with a population of 65 million, the fifth largest economy in the world by nominal GDP, a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, a key player in transatlantic relations, especially in NATO. And we do know that we regret but need to respect the outcome of what had happened. I think this underlines one thing worth saying at the outset, is that it confirms for us that the European Union is an association of free states based on the free will of free peoples. It's one positive in the unfortunate context that I do underline, because frequently the characterization of the EU as a construct is prone to either misunderstanding or misrepresentation. The European Union has not been built at the point of an imperial sword. The European Union has not been built from the barrel of an ideological gun. The European Union has been constructed by the free will of free peoples. On the 23rd of January in 1963, only some months before his assassination, President Kennedy wrote a letter to Jean Monnet, to whom he was presenting a special award in Washington, D.C. I read for you the second paragraph of that letter. For centuries, emperors, kings, dictators have sought to impose unity on Europe by force. For better or worse, they have failed. But under your inspiration, Europe has moved closer to unity in less than 20 years than it had done in 1,000 years before. You and your associates have built with the mortar of reason and the brick of economic and political interest. You are transforming Europe by the power of a constructive idea. And I think that is a truth that still holds. As I remarked, the UK invoked Article 50, and it recalls you're free to join and free to leave. And so in principle, this is also open to Ireland. We're joined, and we're free to leave. So I want to pause for a moment to reflect on that question, and to suggest to you that the mortar of reason and the brick of economic and political interest suggest that this is not a road that Ireland should choose to travel. Let us step back about 50 years, not quite, but to the year 1970, which itself, not quite, was about 50 years after independence. Ireland in 1970 was arguably the poorest region, though independent politically, of the British regional economy. Politically independent, but economically unfree. 60% of our exports went to the UK, 54% of our imports came from the UK. The Irish punt was tied to sterling, and we followed UK monetary policy. Agriculture and food, today very important, and we discussed it at length this morning on Brexit. In 1970, accounted for 20% of our national output and extraordinarily 27% of our national employment. And that whole sector was subjugated to depend on the cheap food policy of the United Kingdom. And so when the United Kingdom decided to apply under Macmillan, and then later a second application under Harold Wilson, Ireland had no choice. We were so connected through trade in this post-colonial trading relationship that where they went, we needed to follow. Let me come to today, not quite 50 years on, but 46 years after that 1970 arbitrary choice of a base year. From 60% of exports, 2016 exports to the UK, 13%. From 54% of our imports in 1970, 24% in 2016. Agriculture, then 1/5 of our national output, today slightly greater than 1/20 of our output. Agriculture then employing 27%, agriculture and food, 27% of our labour force, today 8.5%. I tell this not to trivialise the importance of the challenge to agriculture and food, but to locate its relative scale to our economy compared to those several decades ago. If I look at last year's data in trade in goods and services, Ireland has about 17% of our GDP tied up in trade with Britain. Not all of that is going to crash and burn, but some of it will be stressed. That means there's 83% of our GDP that is tied up with something else. We should not risk the terminal economic uncertainty through poor judgment of risking the 83% to secure that part of the 17% which we deem to be at risk. Terminal pneumonia is not the ideal cure for severe flu, and we should be very careful in our interests not to confuse those things. It's not a time also, I believe, for us to self-impose a currency uncertainty in leaving the EU, should we choose to do it, and raising the question about what would the currency regime be thereafter. It's not a time for us to choose to be a Norway, which must pay but has no say, in a European Economic Area, which includes trade in goods but excludes agriculture, the very sensitivity that causes some to argue that Norway could be one of the solutions. I normally like to deliver analysis and to have less of myself, but some of these things are bound up with one's own view. I do not want to bet my children's and grandchildren's future on Little Englander identity politics. I do not want our country to succumb to the politics of the grievance of others as the driver of our future national aspirations. I do not want the buffoonery of Boris Johnson to loom large for our future political choices, offending Italians about Prosecco, having his cake and eating it, and posturing arrogantly in his go whistle remarks as the clock ticks. I do not want to see this country back in a post-colonial slipstream marked by such total indifference to the existing parts of today's disunited kingdom, Scotland's wishes and Northern Ireland's needs, choked from oxygen deficiency in the UK's referendum debate and in its national media coverage of the consequences. I do not want the country of my birth, of my residence, of my citizenship, existing in what Tony Blair, in this much reported speech, but this bit has not been reported, recently called the fast lane of progress. We don't want, as a small state, to lose our agility and to be part of that fast lane of progress, and to end up in what he characterised for Brexiting Britain as, and I quote Blair, existing on the hard shoulder of nostalgia. In 1971, addressing the Commonwealth Studies Institute in London, Gareth Fitzgerald was right when he said, and I quote, "The size differential between Ireland and the UK makes it impossible to tackle issues through bilateral negotiation. In the EEC, he said, this would give way to multilateral partnership. He was right then. That is still right today. In the middle of our decade of commemoration, in recalling our struggle for our freedom, I hope that 1 century later, we won't really contemplate returning to that from whence we came. We stand in the EU, yes, as small, and yes, as peripheral. It was ever thus, and will be, by virtue of our geography. But we are there in EU law on the basis of the equality of member states. Not equal size, equal weight, or always equal say, but having the status of being an equal participant has a dignity for any participating nation which should not be traduced in our analysis. We Irish are summoned to believe in and to represent ourselves, to build up those bricks of our own political and economic interest. And they should be joined by the mortar of reason and by mutual respect and solidarity. I've never believed that by participating in the European process, we had to be less Irish. As someone who was privileged to spend so many years in European institutions, I always believed it made us more effective as Irish. Our place should not be to bob on the uncertain seas of the UK as it Brexits Europe. We should choose the anchor of the safe harbour that we know, testing as it will be, because tests assuredly there will come. I think there's little good in ourselves self-deprecating, talking ourselves down as the good little Europeans doing what we're told. We certainly have been through some rough times with our austerity, and disputed and contested times with our banking system. And to tell the truth, we have to take some of the blame ourselves, but not necessarily all of it. When I look at the extraordinary failure of Irish bank supervision, when I look at the extraordinary greed of Irish men and women who bid up the price of our homes and our country by selling and buying ourselves to ourselves at inflated rates, that wasn't done by foreigners, although the liquidity was greatly assisted from outside. We are in the European Union with all of its potential constraints, given again size and peripherality, but we are there to try to achieve our interest and work for the common good. For me, this country is the repository of the constitutional, the institutional, the cultural, historical, and political traditions that I hold most dear as a person. In European terms, we are in this debate about living on the edge. As Columbanus wrote in the scriptorium in Bobbio before he died early in the 7th century, he said he and his monks were the ultimi habitatores mundi, that they came from the edge of the world. That was the edge of the then known world. But we're on the edge, the western edge of this European world. I quoted those words of St. Columbanus on the day I had the privilege to be elected to the presidency of the European Parliament. They may or may not have resonated with colleagues, but for me they resonated because after 3 or 4 months of internal contest and 4 rounds of contested election, to stand as an Irishman on that podium, at the heart of European democracy in that institution, emotionally meant something to me for my Irishness, not the Europeanness, which of course was the bonus. And I think too often we confuse being for Europe with being less Irish, and this is a state of confusion that we should confront. Let me turn quickly, if I can, to the EU part. The European Union has been through an extraordinarily testing and stressful decade. The financial and banking crisis and its fallout, socially, economically, and politically, has left deep cleavages. Cleavages between the North and the South, cleavages between creditor and debtor states. We've been challenged in recent years by unprecedented migratory flows. These have caused significant political cleavages between East and West in the European Union. The periphery to the east of Europe, the three small states Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, and their larger neighbour Poland, are deeply anxious about Russian revanchism and aggression in their region. And if we demand of these and others solidarity, they will wonder what is the two-way street through which our solidarity also might pass for them. The terrorist toxins of radical Islam have killed people in the United Kingdom, in France, in Germany, in Denmark and in Sweden, all just in the last 2 or 3 years. And then, if that wasn't enough, we have the unprecedented Brexit. I think all of these together have stretched the institutional capacity of the European Union. And still it's there. It's resilient, even if it isn't entirely settled and successful in addressing all of those things. When Mr. Trump was elected in the United States, and before him, when the referendum happened in Great Britain, the wave of grievance politics and identity politics and me first politics that was spoken to by those two results appeared to threaten continental Europe and therefore created a deep anxiety what was the imminent future of the European process. Tested in the Austrian presidential election in December, a line was held. Tested in the Netherlands in legislative elections in March, a line was held. Tested in France, there was a spectacular reinvention of the centre under President Macron. And the Alternative for Deutschland, to be tested nationally in September in Germany, will get seats in the Bundestag, but will not get the kind of number that had been discussed, anticipated, or feared by some time earlier. Populism, of course, hasn't gone away, because some of the reasons that underlie it and the grievances have not gone away. But what it has done, this arrest of that flow, is to buy necessary time, not to do nothing, but to do some things and to do them better. Europe needs, and the Minister touched on it last night, to spend a bit more time thinking about how to touch people's hearts and minds with its public policy. I think Europe needs to spend less time about what Europe is and more about what it does and fails to do. I think we need to talk about institutions and getting them right, but first we need to talk about capacity to act and instruments of public policy to be able to act, and then institutionally to fit the form of the institution to the function which it should serve. I think Europe needs more agility in responding to crisis. And if our only crisis resolution mechanism is to refer everything to a European Council whose purpose was meant to be a strategic overview instead of day-to-day management choices, we will drown in the meddling qualities of something which is politically of the highest class in the institutions, but institutionally not best able to deal with the day-to-day management of crisis, which means we need to be able to liberate Europe to do some things better. Not more Europe for Europe's sake, but a more effective Europe for the sake of Europeans. there's much to be discussed in this. And I think if we look at the impatience with politics that has come through populism, I think what we need to try to do is not to do everything better, but some things better. I think Ireland can play a real role in this. We should not resile from expressing our views and our interests. We should not resile from bringing our experiences to that table of reform. I think in the end that in Ireland we should continue to believe in and to engage in the power of this constructive idea. I think in Ireland we should learn from history, as I remarked earlier, and learn not to repeat the history to bring us back to places from which we had already escaped. And I think in the very end of this, we are small, we are limited in size, scale and wealth, but unlimited in talent, capacity and the ability to reason. And in a system based on the power of reason and the rule of law, we can bring much to that table, and we should do it with self-confidence.